Let me bring in Ambassador Dilip Sinha at this point. Ambassador Sinha, are you optimistic? What do you make of the significance of the NSA trip, the resumption of the structured special representatives dialogue after a gap of 5 years, but continuing concerns about China's intents, China's construction activity, how far back they have actually moved from the positions that led to the face-off, and continuing concerns really about China's ambition. Some might even use the word neo-imperialism.
Well, Barkha, I would entirely agree with what General Shukla has just said. There is a continuing concern about China's intent, China's actions. Uh, this de-escalation, as you called it, China has never called it de-escalation. From whatever little I've read Chinese newspapers, they have always called it an arrangement. And even India has not ever said that the status quo ante has been restored. We talk about de-escalation, perhaps disengagement, but these are terms that don't really indicate or mean that the Chinese have withdrawn to positions and removed their permanent setups that they had made in areas which they did not have before 2020. Now, as far as Chinese intent is concerned, the intent to absorb Tibet is so strong now that they are now insisting upon using this Chinese name for Tibet, Xizang, in all their communications with countries. They just used it with Nepal. So their policy of absorbing Tibet remains as strong as ever. The villages that they're constructing on the border, that is going on in full swing. And on top of that, what General Shukla mentioned about the issue of the larger Chinese challenge to India, that also needs to be addressed. And our imports from China, and everybody talks about our dependence on China because of our imports from it, is actually going up and has gone up in the last 4 years, ever since the government made the policy of trying to reduce our dependence. So because of this lack of the larger debate of the Chinese challenge, our economic dependence upon China is increasing, and while we may be, and I'm sure, we'll be able to tackle the threat on the LSC. I don't see any let up in China's policy or attitude towards either the border situation or the relations with India.
But then, Ambassador Sinha, if you're saying that India has never actually said that the status quo ante has been restored, and that China has never actually used the word de-escalation, then when we use the phrase disengagement, what does that phrase mean? That we are somewhat at a better place than before, but we're not quite where we need to be.
Well, I suppose going by what our government has said and what everybody else, people like you in the media, are saying, I don't have access to in a negotiation points. That the situation has improved considerably, that the eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation that was there has changed, but I don't have any inside information on this. I just presume the fact that our External Affairs Minister has made certain statements that the situation has improved. Everybody else is calling it a rapprochement, and Mr. Doval has gone across to China now, means that the situation must have improved. But I don't think that the larger challenge or the threat of China has reduced.
If the threat of China has not reduced, Professor Raja Mohan, then some might wonder on what basis these special representatives dialogue or talks have been resumed. Obviously, there is some improvement. There is some rapprochement. The troops are not locked in eyeball-to-eyeball battle, as both General Shukla and Ambassador Sinha said, but both seem to be suggesting that we are not at the place that we were. So to that extent, the status quo ante of the LSC has not been restored. When you heard the announcement of the final phase of disengagement had been completed, and that was said as of 21st October, but we also have information that as recently as 23rd October, 2 days after that, China was pushing ahead with construction activity in the Depsang area. What does that say to you?
I think what the government has said is there are two phases to going back to status quo ante. Now, one is disengagement, which means moving away from very, very close face-off type of positions, to one de-escalation, which means actually moving the forces out of the theater and going back to the peacetime locations. By government's own admission, we only done the first phase. So in a way,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there is a claim that we've gone back to where we were in the spring of 2020. Second, I think that brings me to the second question. I mean, why are we then talking? My sense is the getting to de-escalation, which is on the agenda, according to the minister's
Mm-hmm.
statement in the parliament, that since the principal negotiators on the boundary dispute are the so-called special representatives, which is our national security advisor, and then Mr. Wangi, who is also the foreign minister on their side. So all that we are doing is the reactivation of the principal mechanism to discuss the boundary, the issues relating to the boundary. So if the two NSAs agree to find a way of actually de-escalating, then I think we would make progress. But knowing the Chinese, nothing happens in a hurry. So I think we are really at the very, very beginning of a process of dealing with the second stage. And then related to that is the larger question. What we don't know at this point, do the talks between the two special representatives, are they limited to the border issues? Are they also going to talk about more broader relationship? Because the Chinese want to go back to business as usual. They want to see constraints on Chinese engagement, on the economic and commercial engagement with India lifted. So that remains to be seen. But I think on its own, I don't think this resumption of these talks, and also expected at the foreign secretary level, on their own, they mark any big breakthrough. I think we're just moving to the second stage of de-escalation, which is going to be much harder to achieve than disengagement, because as you yourself said, removing all the construction and other deployments that has taken place is going to be harder. And finally, I would reinforce what General Raj Shukla was saying. I think the problem is really the growing gap in the comprehensive national power of China and India. China is at $18 trillion today. India is barely at 4. Chinese per capita income is around 12,000. We are barely at $2,800. And the Chinese spend 5 times more than India on defense. And our own defense expenditure has fallen below 2%. And the big reforms, even those that Prime Minister Modi has announced from the Red Fort, have not taken place. So I think our challenges are really, are we ready to undertake comprehensive reforms in our defense sector? Because it's not that you don't need numbers alone. They can be asymmetric strategies to deter China. But I think that requires actually a debate, a significant reform of our defense organization. That's where the real challenges are. These diplomatic related negotiations will continue. But I think where we need to move is really, are we investing enough in our defense? Are we able to create the deterrence needed to stop? Because we have almost 4,000 kilometers of disputed frontier where the Chinese can move at any point, given the military modernization and infrastructure that they've created. So how do you deter that? I think that problem is nowhere near resolution.
So Hasani, would you agree that that there has never been a claim by anybody, neither by the government in India nor by China, that there has been a restoration of the positions of the spring of 2020, and this is a phase-wise thawing. So it is quite literally a thaw. Like a thaw is not a melt, a thaw is a thaw, and to that extent, everything is per plan, everything is per expectation, anticipation, or do you have a different concern?
No, well, certainly there was a lot of confusion in that first week. After the foreign secretary announced that there was an agreement, we heard External Affairs Minister Jaishankar speak maybe an hour later at a television function. Maybe he didn't have all the facts, and he said, we expect to go back to 2020. In fact, he said disengagement is complete, and we expect to go back to pre-2020 status quo positions. A couple of days later, obviously, this was explained by the government. They said we're only talking about Depsang and Demchok, where the last agreement was. After that, they explained that the buffer zones will remain. As far as the buffer zones are concerned, as long as they remain, there's no question of going back to status quo 2020. As far as Depsang and Demchok are concerned, we're told that there are patrolling arrangements and that these patrolling arrangements kind of mirror what they were in 2020, but we have not seen that. So I can't confirm that. General Raj Shukla seems to suggest that some military gains were extracted from the Chinese side. I honestly have not heard that yet. What I've heard is that the patrolling arrangements that have been discussed and agreed to and in Depsang and Demchok have to be verified on the ground. And that verification process is going on. Be that as it may, we are today at a point where the National Security Advisor is in Beijing. That's the first such visit, high-level visit, since 2020 happened. This is the first SR talks, the 23rd round, that is happening since 2019. So we do know that, and I think we need to understand that the SRs are not supposed to be discussing disengagement, de-escalation, and all the rest of that. That is being done at a completely different level. The fact that the SRs are meeting is a sign that India is prepared to normalize its ties with China. It's a step towards normalization. I think you have to differentiate between the negotiations that have been continuing for the last 4 years and the SR talks. If the SR talks didn't happen for 5 years and are happening now, it means some kind of step towards normalization is being undertaken by the government. Now, the three questions that I would have over there, Barkha, to begin with, is that we are still at a position where we don't know why China did what it did in April of 2020. This is something that's been repeatedly said by External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, that we are not aware of the reasons for China amassing its troops, for transgressing along our line of actual control. So that's the one. The second is prior to 2019, Prime Minister Modi met with Chinese President Xi Jinping 18 times. In that space of 2014 to 2019. That's 18 times in 5 years. That's a very, very high concentration of meetings between the two principals. If that is the case, what did they discuss about the boundary? We have no idea about where those boundary talks have gone. And I think now is a good time to give some kind of clarity on where India believes this whole conversation is going. I say this because otherwise we will go back to a situation like 2020 and not be any the wiser. I think the third has to be some clarity from the government on patrolling. What kind of arrangements have been agreed to, and what is the plan with these buffer zones? Are we now going to sort of just live with these buffer zones that have never been agreed to in the past, and that now for the last 4 years have become a sort of way of fixing a problem? I think they are a short-term measure. They are not the final measure. And we need to know from the government how long they expect that this measure will continue. So I would say the fact that the NSA is in Beijing for these talks is already an acknowledgement that the government is looking towards moving towards some of its normal conversations, engagements with the.
And does that surprise you?
Well, it certainly seems to be coming from the fact that there has been a de-escalation announced, that a disengagement at least has been announced. And already the foreign ministers have met, if you remember, after the announcement. And the foreign ministers have agreed to discuss the resumption of trade, investment, direct flights, religious pilgrimages. So all of those came out of the statement when Mr. Jaishankar met Mr. Wang Yi. So I don't think it should be surprising. I'm just saying that we need to really see what today's meeting in Beijing is about. It is about a resumption of the SR level talks. After all, Mr. Wang Yi and Mr. Doval have met in the last 4 years. They met as recently in Moscow. On the sidelines of the NSA meetings for the SCO. But none of those have been called SR level meetings. So now this 23rd round that is being held after 5 years is clearly some kind of a resumption of normal engagement.